Today's presentation by West Bath Historical Society is given by David Hennessey, who's going to talk about his family's saltwater farm over generations, and more recently, the raising of oysters, the Winter Point oysters on Mill Cove area. So, David, take it.
Okay, we'll try it. First of all, there was a rumor I heard this week about samples, and somebody may have come for samples of oysters today. There are no samples, so forget that. The Winter Point name came from a mother's side of the family who were Winters back from colonial days, and that's how we decided on the name of Winter Point. We carried it forward and seemed fitting to carry this out that way. This is just a sample of what the oysters look like. They do have a unique color. Tends to be, each site is different as far as the makeup, and the chemicals in the water or in the mud. The minerals in the mud give them all the different colors depending on where the site is. You can look, if I can get the pointer working, you can almost see this are 3-year oysters. That's one growth line, 2 growth line. It's in its 3rd year. And most of the oysters will grow to market size around 3 years. Some a little faster, and some a little slower, but generally around 3 years. And that's a typical oyster knife that we do use. This is an older map that Peter found and put on for me. It shows the Stevens River, now New Meadows River. Mill Cove is up in here. It's a little different shape from what it is really, but this is Barriers Mill Road, the hill going across, and it doesn't show Brown's Island, which should be right in here, but it is quite accurate for the time. This shows a little newer version of the maps. The star is where Winter Point is located. The lease site from the state of Maine goes out 150 feet or so, down around and by the island, up back and through. It's about 13 acres. We lease it from the state of Maine. Even though the deed from the farm was part of a King's grant, and they say that we own to low water mark. The state of Maine says, no, you don't. So we had to lease it from the state of Maine, which gives us rights to the surface as well as the bottom. All of the 13 acres is not usable because some cases the mud is just too soft, and the oysters will sink in the mud. As far as the deed goes, when I surveyed this with my Uncle George in the early 70s, we found a pile, a pyramid of rocks out here, which you can only see on a full moon, big drain tide. So when they surveyed this, how many years ago, they used the low water mark, because we own to the low water mark by deed. This is a more recent view of the farm. This would be north, south, east, and west. West going over there. It does show Brown's Island. The family farm is up here. My house is here. Another sister's over here. Our cousin is now up in here. Our brother is down in here. It's all family land. It's what's left of the King's Grant, which used to run from Kennebec to New Meadows. But over a period of 300 years, big families, a few acres here to family members, a few acres there, it disappears. I'll go back to that one second. This is an area view DMR took years ago, probably 20 years ago or more. It shows, I'm clicking the wrong button here, shows the Meadow River up here. This is the end of the mountain road. The old yacht club was out here, in Sabino, out in this area. Sabino Spindle over here. Over to your left further would be Barriers Mill Road Bridge, looking out to the west to our fields. This was taken as a project from DMR. They've actually designated this cove as a natural resource protection zone because of the cohogs that still grow up there. And this is a more recent show of the farmhouse. It was probably built in the late 70s. This was pretty much a self-reliant farm. There were 2 barns on the farm, a blacksmith shop. They had another old house. It was probably pre-1800s that brothers and I were probably in mid-60s. We tore it down and built a workshop for Dad out of the old house in the barn. Go back just a little bit. As far as some of the early history, they used to boil salt water on this middle point, and it's actually called Salt Works Point. That was an industry. They had big kettles out there and boiled the water. They also, in more recent years, in the 40s and 50s, High Windlass had clam bakes out there, and even the Elks and others had clam bakes out there. The family still has a camping area down here that's designated. There's no permanent structures, and different family members camp out down there, and every year there's a good-sized family reunion at 4th of July for a week of 10 days. It's a lot of fun. On this point over here, going down towards Winter Point, Oysters, they built coastal schooners in the 1870s, at least 3 of them. So they had a lot going on back then. This is a view looking towards the east, over the pump house. And this is a view looking from the fields to Winter Point. Over here you can see the barge and the floats out there. We do have a gentleman from East Brunswick who cuts the hay every year in these 2 fields. We give him the hay just to keep the fields open. As we grew up as kids, there were no trees here, nothing. And you look at the point over here, how the trees have all grown up. So if we didn't cut these fields in a few years, that would be all forest. This is a look of the oyster seeds. They're about 2 millimeter when we buy them, just a little flake. And you can hold 1 million seeds in 2 hands with no problem. They usually buy them middle of May, end of May, from a local hatchery in Damariscotta. And they'll raise them for 2 to 3 years before they can sell them. We buy the seed, we put them in these upwellers. These silos you see right here have screen bottoms. So the more water you pump at these little seed, the faster they'll grow. They'll grab more food out of this. So the water is pumped in, and it fills up to the screen bottoms and flows out through. And that's how we get them to grow. You jump it, they'll grow double in size in 2 or 3 days once they're established. It takes 2 or 3 days for oysters to settle down. If you start handling too much, they do get stressed out and will kill them. You can tell they're stressed because the color changes from a gray-black color, and they'll start getting white spots. And that lets you know they're stressed, and you've got to leave them alone, let them settle in. That's another view of the upwellers. You can see go back again. You can see the piping, these are the outflow for the water. Comes up through the silos and runs out. Have to regulate the pressure. You blow the oysters up the seed and out they'll go. This is son-in-law Ryan cleaning the silos. You pretty much clean them every day or so because there's so much silt in the water that they'll plug up the oysters themselves. And they can't feed, they're stressed out, and the kid kill them. And the screens plug up with seaweed and other things. And also, when you're culling them like this and cleaning, you're knocking off would-be barnacle sets or mussel sets, which will get sucked into the system, and they love it in there. It's nice and warm in the tub, and they think it's great. Good place to grow. This is the upweller again with probably month-old seed. And if they didn't handle a little bit, they wash it off with a hose, swish them around, get the silt out. These oysters would clump together like they do in the wild. And that's a miserable thing to deal with when they're all clumped. They don't grow well. They're hard to clean and everything else. And you can't sell them that way. That's a view of the western side of Browns Island, which is right in front. It is said by some family members that some of our ancestors were shipbuilding captains and shippers. Some were pirates. So the rumor was there was buried treasure on the island. We never found it. There's a big hole out there, but we never found the treasure. These poles right here are marking circles of oysters when they're planting. And this is a barge load of probably 1.25 inch, 1.5 oysters. They've grown over the summer, and they're getting ready to put down the bottom in circles. They put them in circles, roughly 20,000 oysters per circle, so somewhat keep tab on the inventory to know where they stand as they're harvesting. And those are some of the circles. You can see these circles on a big drain, a full moon drain. Other than that, the bed's underwater. And there's Ryan with a bull rake. And at low tide, some of the beds they can rake the oysters. It's back-breaking work. It's not easy. They call it a bull rake for a reason. This is why it's called Winter Point. This was taken a few years ago, which shows how the cove does lock up. You can have a skim of ice, or you can have 3 feet of ice out there. The worst part about the ice is when it leaves in the spring, you got to be careful. You're going to lose your floats and your boats and everything. You got to really watch the ice. Another scene where the guys have cut holes in the ice in wintertime to do some raking to sell oysters. We're one of the few oyster businesses in the state that actually harvest all year long and get relatively fresh oysters in the wintertime. Most places shut down, like Damariscotta River. It freezes over. They're done in the wintertime. And that's, I believe, Brother Jim cutting the oysters. He came back to Maine in probably 1995 and wanted to do something with the farm that fit with the farm traditions. And he came with the idea of oysters. His thought there was the clams in the Mill Cove have always been known for their flavor and their taste. So we thought, well, if they taste good, why wouldn't oysters taste good? So he talked with a few people in the state, including a longtime friend, Dana Wallace, who was a state biologist with DMR for 40 years, and decided to try some oysters in '95 in floating trays. They grew well. The next year I joined Jim and we put a few more out. There again, they grew well that year, good survival rate. In '97, we bought a 3-year lease, or didn't bought, we obtained a 3-year experimental lease in the state of Maine. And our thoughts on the 3-year lease was the 3-year is a good growth period. They're market ready in 3 years. So we know in 3 years if this would work or not. If it didn't grow, that was it. So the 3-year lease did work out. This is a family friend, Jerry Wallace, who's been raking through the ice in probably February or March that year. That shows the total of oysters he's raked up to put in the tote. They're probably 3.5 year oysters. And that's John, Jim's son, who now owns Winter Point. He's culling and counting the oysters and sorting them out by size. He sizes oysters for different customers, some like 2 3/4, all the way up to jumbos, which can be 10 or 12 inches long. Most people, a 3-inch oyster is the market size. But over the last 4 or 5 years, John's developed a market for these large ones, which in years past, we had no place to sell them. No one wanted them. And also what we call the ugly ones, which grow every which way with long beaks and crooked and hard to shuck. But he's found a market for that as well, so it's worked out well for the big and the ugly. This is a end of the day harvest. They're just getting to wrap up. They've been raking through the ice and going to call it a day. And that ice out there is probably 2 feet thick. In some years, when the ice is right, if you get a ice like this, then a rainstorm, and it smooths over good skating ice. When we were kids, we skated all the way up to Birch Point, which is probably close to 2 miles down the river. Probably our mother didn't know that. And there again, you can see the hole they cut in the ice, and they're still raking. That's a total of oysters. They'll go through and clean them and sort them out by size. And in the wintertime, you've got to be careful. If it's too cold and you find on the sorting table it's icing up, you can't leave the oysters out in the weather because they'll freeze. And what we have learned over the years, if an oyster freezes solid, you don't move it around, it'll survive. It'll thaw and live. But if you jiggle it around, like culling and packing up for shipping, you'll kill it. The other side of the coin is in the summertime, you can take an oyster and leave it in the bank in 80-degree weather, and it'll survive for 2 or 3 weeks. So they can stress easy, but they're also pretty tough. That is John with Jim in the background, doing some more table work, getting ready to sell. They sell the oysters in 100-count bags, and that is one of the bags. Whoops, that was a bag. There's a bag right there where they're putting in 100-count bags. The bags now have our name on it, our logo. We trademarked the name in 2001. It's registered a Winter Point name because we found some other people tried to sell Winter Points that weren't Winter Points. That was quite a process. But we incorporated in 2000. And the lease, 10-year lease was also in 2000. There's a batch of oysters ready to be cleaned and sorted and shipped out. And he's still counting and sorting. So a long process. It's no fun in the wintertime out there. It gets pretty cold. This is where they wash the oysters on this table, and that's actually shell, wasted shell. There is quite a bit of death with oysters. Every site is different. We deal with problems of horseshoe crabs, starfish, eider ducks, diseases. There are 2 main oyster diseases, MSX and SSO. They're related cousins, you'd say, but they tend to kill an oyster when it's 2 to 3 years old. So you've raised it all that time, and it flares up. You never know. It's in the water naturally. Doesn't hurt to eat them, won't hurt people, but it will kill the oysters. Muscatto Rivers had some cases of MSX in the last couple of years, and it wipes out 90% of the beds. We try to combat that with saving oysters that survive this outbreak of disease and giving those to the hatchery for our brood stock. So you hope they're somewhat resistant. We also buy oysters that have been raised over the years by Rutgers University to be disease resistant. Some years it works, some years it doesn't. You're John culling and sorting and washing them up. It's farming and fishing in Mother Nature, and every year something different comes out. You think one year you solved the problem, and next year you realize you haven't solved that problem. It's a gamble some years. Jim's finishing the final prep, cleaning them off, taking the barnacles off. They take a lot of time in cleaning the oysters before they go to market. This has been a back saver for the guys doing this. It's actually little cement mixers. And they put scrub brushes inside of them and run water to them. You can see the water running in these pipings. And those are the brushes, the scrub brushes. And as they turn, it washes the oysters. It cuts down a lot of back-breaking work. Every year you've got to try to develop an easy way to do it, especially as everybody gets older out there. It makes a big difference. This is the barge they bought 2 years ago. It's aluminum versus the old wooden and fiberglass one we had it. Got a hydraulic boom on it, so when they drag, a 4-foot drag across the bottom, they're not picking it up by hand. They're using the hydraulic boom to pick it up. And they usually have to hold the drag by a rope and shake it to clean the mud off the oysters and knock out some of the busted shell. Now this hydraulic boom can shake it for them, and that's a big difference. With this barge, they can also break up the skim ice in the early winter. And up until 2 weeks ago, the cove was open because they could bust up the skim ice. Now it's pretty well solid. And unfortunately, there's 2 or 3 feet of snow on top of the ice, so it makes it very hard to harvest. So it's tough right now to sell many oysters. This is a refrigerated truck they bought a couple of years ago because DMR and FDA, who governs us, rules us, was finding they wanted more refrigeration control on shipping oysters. In Maine, there is no season you can't sell oysters, as opposed to down south when it's warm in the summer. They can't sell oysters because of diseases that will kill you. Those don't grow up here. Luckily, the water's cold enough. But they have instituted more checks and balances. So we went to a refrigerated truck, and some of the people who buy, some of the customers in Portland, will take the temperature of the oyster when you receive it. They want to know it's cold. Unlike most harvesters, Winter Point will take the oysters out of the water that day. Within an hour, they're in the truck, and they're on their way to Portland or wherever. They don't sit in coolers, which makes it a fresher oyster. DMR is good. They do watch the cove. They do water testing all year long, except now. It's frozen over. But they water test at least once a month for pollution. It takes so long to build up a reputation as a good oyster, a clean oyster, a healthy oyster. You don't want to sell an oyster and get somebody sick. It would just really, really hurt your business. So DMR is very active in that. For many years, we also tested for red tide. When the count is too high, the state shuts you down. We stopped doing that a few years ago when they put a buoy out there that monitors all by itself. But we still send samples down to Booth Bay to DMR when red tide does flare up, just to monitor the rate of the red tide. It also helps the local clammers keep their markets and their flats open longer, because we send samples down. They know it's not a high count yet. They don't do a blanket closure of the whole cove now. They can pick and choose and locate where they're going to close. A funny thing about American oysters, which we found out over the years, when red tide gets thick and heavy and the state would shut you down by counts, American oysters stop pumping. They more or less close up. They don't like red tide, whereas clams, mussels, quahogs, European oysters take in the red tide, and they're closed first. American oysters are the last to go as far as the red tide count. It's got to be real thick for the Americans to get that count in them. And that's not the reason we send samples down there to Booth Bay. That's the Winter Point logo on a 100-count bag. And if you look right here, those are the seed we buy them. I believe there's 15 seeds around this quarter. And that's the size of them. And that's what we have for oysters in West Bath.